Great. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Just a really quick overview. In this Dreamer workshop, we're going to be reviewing entrepreneurship resources. Specifically, we're going to hear about ways to think about income for individuals who do not have work authorization. So we're going to look at different avenues in which individuals can pursue a professional career. We're going to hear from Professor David Hoffman, College of Business, as well as Kevin Omaña Mendoza from Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. And with that, I will let you all take it away. You should be able to share your screen just fine. And either you, David, or Kevin can go first. I'm not sure if you have a preference either which way.
Kevin, I'm okay if you go first. Explain what your organization is, and then I'll go second.
Yeah, sure. So the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're a statewide membership coalition that provides policy, advocacy, and direct services for impacted immigrants in Colorado. We have a national partnership through various networks. So for those who come to us outside of Colorado, although we cannot directly help, we are able to provide resources. Ultimately, the goal of CIRC is to create a more equitable state in Colorado where immigrants and non-immigrants are treated as one and have equal access and ability to success in the state of Colorado.
Thank you, Kevin. David, if you want to introduce yourself.
Well, I was going to ask Kevin a couple of questions, but anyway. So Kevin, who are your major clients? Who do you spend most of your time with?
Absolutely. So our major demographic is immigrants, both documented and undocumented, in the Denver metro area. We have an equal access to immigrants in the state, but as you know, the majority of immigrants are either in the Denver metro or in the rural agricultural areas. We primarily serve non-immigrants with driver's license and other initiatives to provide support. But really, a lot of our work is focused on policy and transformation. So we help folks in the Denver metro area as much as we do in the rural parts of Colorado.
Wow. Maybe a loaded question, but what are your biggest issues?
Absolutely. So our biggest issues right now have really been the dramatic ways in which the immigration system has been transformed in the last 4 years. So all of the barriers and fear mongering that has been brought about by this administration. Although we believe in the free thought and the ability to disagree on issues and topics, we do understand that impacted folks who we work with are being severely disadvantaged, and it being kept out due to fear mongering and other issues. So for us, the biggest issue right now is the way the immigration system has kind of come to a halt, and the various systems of oppression that have been heightened to make it impossible for immigrants to live a healthy life here in Colorado. So for us, that's our biggest issue. Outside of that, really trying to figure out ways in which we can create transformation for undocumented immigrants. So folks who don't have permanent residency and folks who don't have citizenship, how they can still create sustainability in Colorado. So undoing a lot of the damaging legislation that was passed in 2006 when the anti-immigrant agenda kind of took Colorado by storm. And outside of that, you know, as a nonprofit and as a grassroots-based organization, really trying to create radical change and transformation with an emphasis on creating leaders in the community. Anything else, David?
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And David, are you still with us? Okay, we may have lost David there for a hot second. But with that, Kevin, do you want to start sharing your slides?
Yeah, give me a quick second.
Sounds good. And while Kevin gets set up, thank you all for tuning in. We are recording this workshop. It will show up on the Immigrant Services webpage. Also, as a quick heads up, as you may have heard, the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, which is the organization that Kevin is with, as well as the Immigrant Services Program on campus and the Denver Children's Advocacy Center, have partnered up to essentially establish a primarily community serving program called UndocuHub. We are in the middle of developing a website, so if you go to the Immigrant Services Program website at msudenver.edu, you'll actually see an early version of that website. You will also start to see resources show up there. So workshops such as this, but also resources and professionals regarding mental health, housing resources, food access and financial assistance, healthcare, and really the most crucial needs that we see within the immigrant and undocumented community will be addressed there. So stay tuned for that. More is coming there.
Let's go ahead and get started. The purposes of this first presentation, it'll be the first of two parts. Really, our focus with this, when we were drafting it, Gregor and I, we were discussing what happens if DACA goes away, or what were to have happened if the Supreme Court said folks who have DACA are no longer able to legally work in the U.S. because the program was invalid at inception. So the purposes of this workshop is this one will really be a two-parter. Half of it we'll cover this week, half of it we'll cover again in 2 weeks, and we'll also have an entrepreneur in the community who will talk more on their personal experiences. Really, the goal of this is to kind of give you all the skeletal structure, so give you some information and give you some potential ideas. CIRC, it will be working with Metro, as Gregor mentioned, to provide more individualized support throughout the coming semester for individuals who have very specific questions or who need additional individualized support. We'll be working on scheduling some office hours in the coming months once we figure out what the rest of the semester is going to look like. But for today, it's simply providing folks with some information. If you already have this information before, then this will just be a simple refresher. And as always, we do have professors here from Metro to provide more insight in areas where CIRC can't. Before I start, I do want to let y'all know that CIRC is not a legal entity, so we do not hire attorneys. We do not have any attorneys on staff. Everything here is common knowledge that has been found on the internet. This workshop has been compiled in collaboration with attorneys and immigration professors, but it is not the product of legal advice. So everything you see here today is simply common knowledge that anyone could take, whether you're a citizen or non-citizen. And really the purposes here are not to violate employment law, but to let y'all know of the legal and sustainable alternatives to acquiring income in the United States. So before we start, as always, we want to mention that Immigrant Rising is an organization specifically built to creating more immigrant entrepreneurs in the United States. Their website, if you Google Immigrant Rising or immigrantrising.org, they started off as the Educators for Equal Consideration, but have since grown. Really, Immigrant Rising provides all of this information and much more on specifics around how to become an entrepreneur. A lot of the information that you'll find here today was taken from there, so we do want to give them attribution, and we also want to mention them for those of you who may not have DACA and are on this call trying to figure out how you'll pay for the semester or how you can accrue income during this pandemic. So give them a check out after this presentation. Now, the first question that we always have is, what do you need to do to start working as an independent contractor? Well, an independent contractor can be anyone who has a special skill or has a vision as to what they want to do. It can usually be specialized or specific. So it's something that you're very well at doing. It's something that you have confidence in. As always, you either need a social security number or an ITIN. Depending on the state you're in and depending on the profession, you require a state license. And as always, In the United States, to start up a business, it's relatively cheap, but you do want some startup capital so you're able to have a safety cushion. Why is this important? Well, independent contracting is one means apart from work authorization. Independent contractors are not as restricted as an independent contractor. We'll go over here in a bit some of the differences between being an employee and a contractor, but really anyone can be an independent contractor. Anyone can apply for an ITIN in the United States. Your DACA social does allow you to do a lot of these works, but as many of you will know, such as myself, when you get a social security number under Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, it has that stamp on it that says it's only valid for work authorization. So if for whatever reason you cannot renew DACA or the social you have some potential personal fears of, it's always good to apply for an ITIN as well. When you're doing taxes, you really want to work with a tax broker or a trained individual. If you're going to use multiple numbers, the recommendation is always stick one or the other. But for us with DACA, we've always had to manage with having to do a mixture of them. So those are the 4 big things you need when you want to start off as an independent contractor. Now, what are some common contracting services? Well, you can be a freelance writer, you can do pet care, you can be someone who does accounting, childcare, driving services. All of these are options. The ones that have star asterisks next to theirs have some restrictions. In the state of Colorado, you do have to have either valid work authorization or you have to go before a licensing bureau that has its own restrictions. So if you need a license through DORA in the state of Colorado, do know that for some of these, it will be harder than others. But as you can see here, they're pretty easy and they're not the only ones. If you want to create a business or go into work for yourself, you can do things that aren't listed here. The biggest thing is just making sure, do you need a license for what you're doing? And if so, are there any restrictions? For example, if you want to be a real estate broker, you do have to have valid work authorization. So if you no longer have DACA, you may not be able to get a license for real estate broking. There's current legislature that is in the works to make sure that non-citizens are able to get these, as well as folks who lose DACA are able to keep these licenses. But as of today and as of this recording, nothing is absolute. So always double check and make sure that the information is most up to date for the profession. We want to make sure that you don't have any issues when you're going into this work, and we don't want you to have any fears lingering about not being able to get a license. Some of these are easier than others. For example, with construction, you don't really need a license to do that work. You will need certain types of insurance, but anyone can get insurance in the United States. The price of it, however, is going to vary based on the type of construction you do. Now, what are some key terms that we want folks to take away today? First and foremost, independent contractor. So an independent contractor is an individual or an entity that works independently on a contract basis. You all as individuals, if you go into business, whether it's sole proprietor, it's partnership, or whatever form of entity you form, if you're doing contract work, you would be considered an independent contractor. So whether it's you or your entity, just know that you're an independent contractor if your work is conditional on a contract and not necessarily continuous employment. Who is the client? Well, the client is any individual who has contracted you to do the work. The key phrase here is contracted. Remember, in order to be hired, you have to have work authorization. So if you don't have that, you cannot say the client hired you. Rather, you want to say that they contracted you. A contract is a legal agreement between two parties about that work that will be done. As an independent contractor, a lot of times the burden will be on you to ensure the contract is fair and equitable. Our goal by the end of the next workshop will be to show y'all what it looks like to negotiate contracts, what community partners who are independent contractors in the community have done. Just remember that the contract is the binding document that justifies the relationship between you and the client. It provides an outline of the services you'll provide. So often these are deliverables or tasks, as well as fees and the duration of the contract. The biggest difference between being hired as an employee and being hired as a contractor is that if your contract ends and you're no longer contracted, you are not entitled to payment. As an employee, once you're hired, depending on the length of your job, it can be indefinite or continuous. So always remember that you want to make sure when you do a contract, you take into account the length of the contract For example, if I'm going to do freelance writing, I want to make sure that my contracts are in a length that is sustainable enough for me to continue to earn income, but not too long, because you do not want the client to come under scrutiny for hiring you as a replacement for the employee. The burden is on the client more so than it is on you. Just remember that you want to be conscious and you want to be careful of the length of the contracts. Contracts that are longer than a year can be questionable unless it's a very long-term project. Yeah, I think Gregor can also attest to making sure that when you're doing a contract as an undocumented immigrant, there are a lot of times where scrutiny will be placed or individuals will try to take advantage of you. So always make sure that the contract is healthy and successful to you. And ultimately, you may have to work with the client to come to a mutual agreement, but never put yourself in a contract that will either give you a net loss or will put you in a certain vulnerability. Finally, liability. Liability is defined as the state of responsibility under the law. So when you create an LLC, when you create a sole proprietorship, when you create any entity, you have to assess the type of liability. Let's use that construction company as an example. Well, in construction, there are a lot of liabilities depending on what you're doing. For example, if I do a construction company that builds 3-story buildings, the liabilities there are going to entail the construction, the safety of the workers, the compliance with the city and state, so having to get permits as well as other work, and all the other caveats that come with that. So when you're doing this work, look into the field before you enter to make sure that you're able to cover the liabilities, or if not, make sure you're able to get the insurances to do that. One thing that a lot of independent contractors are never conscious of is entering work without fully conscious of that liability. So for example, if you're going to be someone who says, I have a childcare LLC or I have a service, first and foremost, you want to make sure that the licensure is valid. And let's say in the state of Colorado that they don't require licensure, so anyone can do childcare, daycare. Well, after that, you're going to want to make sure that you're able to do things in the event of emergency. So you want to be CPR and first aid trained. You want to make sure you have an understanding of the dynamics of the child at different stages. So you'll have to have some knowledge there. The biggest thing for you is making sure that if something happens to the child or if something happens in the tenure of your work, you're legally protected. So liability, in short, is just how protected are you and what are the potential risks of doing this business. With that, what are some of the big differences between independent contractors and employees? Well, first and foremost, independent contracting, you're doing specialized work. This is work that you're well versed in, that you're mastered in, and you can do the same type of work for multiple clients in any given periods of time. So if I were to take out an LLC and my LLC washes cars, I could have a contract with 7 different individuals that all be doing the same type of car wash for those individuals in a given period. With an employee, however, you have an ongoing relationship with one entity, one employer. So for example, in the contracting, I can do all of these different contracts with all of these different businesses. As an employee, I'm kind of restricted to one individual in one dynamic. In addition, you have your own equipment and your background expertise. So when you're an independent contractor, nothing is provided for you. You kind of have to provide everything on your own. For example, if I was going to do freelance writing, it would be my responsibility to take care of the printing, the technology, as well as all of the other materials. I can work with a tax agent to have these written off so that they're not a hefty expense. But if I have a contract with, say, Immigrant Services at Metro, the expectation is that I come with all of this ahead of time. If you're an independent contractor, you can't really get the equipment from the person you're doing a contract with, because at that point, there could be some questions as to whether you're a contractor or an employee. However, when you're an employee, your employer provides everything for you. They give you the trainings, they give you the equipment, and over time, there's agreements there. As a contractor, all of that is on you. In addition to that, the pricing. So as an employee, legally, you're required to receive minimum wage at least. So you have a guaranteed wage for a guaranteed period of time. As an independent contractor, this is one of the risks you run. There is no guaranteed wage. You have to negotiate the price and you have to negotiate the period of time. So for example, if Gregor and I were to enter a contract and I was his contractor, Greg could say, I'll pay you $4 on the hour for 10 hours worth of work. legally he can do that because there are no restrictions and I'm not entitled to the minimum wage. I, however, can say, well, Gregor, actually, in the state of Colorado, the average consultation hourly basis for an independent contractor is $100. So if you want me to do this work for 10 hours, I can't do it for 4. If 100 is too much, then we can find a price range where this is how much you pay me for X amount of hours, with the understanding being that it's a fixed set of hours. In addition to that, you get to set your own work schedule. As an independent contractor, you decide when you work, how you work, and the length of which you'll work. All of that gets to be written into your contract with your contractees or your clients. As an employee, however, you have to comply with your employer's work schedule. So, for example, if Gregor says, I'm only going to work Mondays and Fridays from 11 to 2, the university would say, actually, as an employee, you have to be here 8 to 5 on these days, some weekends, and potential holidays. So that's one of the other distinctions. Independent contractors, you only work the length in which your contract is written and the periods in which you get to decide. As an employee, you're kind of stuck with the schedule that's given to you. You use your own methods. You get to decide how the project is going to be completed, how the deliverables are met, and how everything is done. Whereas as an employee, you're told what, when, and how to do it. So if Gregor were to hire me as an employee, Gregor would say, this is what you need to do. This is how the university expects you to do it. And this is when the university needs you to do it by. As a contractor, Gregor can say, these are the deliverables that the university needs, and this is the deadline by which your contract has to be met. But everything else is up to you, and you get to decide that. So depending on the professions you create, you have some flexibility there. With some, you're going to want to make sure that your contracts don't take too long, because then that takes away from other potential work. As an employee, because you only have one relationship, it wouldn't matter if it took away from other work, because you're always going to be in that one spot. But as a contractor, you're not bound to anyone, so you want to make sure that you create your own methods, but these methods are healthy. And then finally, the biggest thing when it comes to taxes, as an independent contractor, you're always going to do W-9 forms. The reason being, as a contractor, your client doesn't pay the taxes on the money that you've earned, whereas as an employee, you have to fill out an I-9 form, and depending on the I-9, some entities say the employer will pay for the taxes, and that'll be deducted from your paycheck or your pay stub. And other instances is, well, the employer will pay for your taxes, but they'll be done in another way, which is compliant with the IRS. The biggest thing is different forms for different things. As a contractor, you are liable and you are legally bound to pay for your own taxes. As an employee, you don't really have to worry about it as much. Obviously, everyone still pays taxes, but it just comes down to how you do it, whether you do it one lump sum at the end of the year or over a stretched out fixed period of time. And for obvious reasons, you cannot become an independent contractor with an I-9 under the IRS. That would be tax evasion and a form of fraud. So when you're doing a contract for your entity, your field, or whichever, make sure that you submit the proper form, which would be a W-9. Now, what are 3 common law rules at defining factors? The first one is behavioral control. So who has the control over how the work is done? The second one, financial control. How do you get paid? How do you manage payments? Where do these payments go? And what is that payment going to look like? And finally, your working relationship. What is the dynamic between the person who's paying and the person who's getting paid? Now, the reason for these 3 aspects is these allow you to define the type of work you're doing. As a contractor, you have the control over how the work is done. You get to decide all of that. As the financial control can be, you're either paid in one lump sum at the end of the contract, you're paid in installments at given checkpoints, but it's all going to be fixed and it's only for a small period of time. And the working relationship is, well, you can't supervise, you can't dictate over, you can simply check in to make sure the metrics are being fulfilled so the installments can be paid. But really, these 3 things are going to be the biggest impact. If we do a quick check on behavioral control, well, with an employee, the work, you're told how the work is being done. You're told how you have to do it, when you have to do it, by when you have to do it, how, and if there's any issues with it, what has to be done to fix it. As a contractor, all of that's on you. Financial control, Well, if you're an employee, you're paid a given salary. The salary is either, exempt, so you get the same amount at the end of every month, at the end of 2 weeks, all those periods. It's all fixed, it's all established. The schedule is beyond your control and you can't alter it. And then finally, the working relationship. Well, if you're an employee, you get supervised, you're told what to do, you're also given the trainings, and the expectation is that you're a representation of the organization or the entity you work for. So for example, when Gregor discusses his working relationship with the university, one of it is Gregor is a representation of both Immigrant Services and the Metropolitan State University of Denver, whereas if Gregor were a contractor, then may not be the same dynamic. Yes, Gregor works for Metro, and yes, depending on the type of contract, Metro may say that Gregor is a representation, but none of that is implied unless Gregor directly fills it in. Now, before we continue, that was a lot of information. Are there any questions from either our partners, or do any of the other presenters also want to step in and give some speaking points?
And you can also put questions in the chat box throughout the presentation. So if questions come up, maybe not immediately right away, but as you hear more, then you can certainly put those in the chat function, or just ask them by unmuting yourself, such as right now.
And again, if your questions are individualized, or because this because this webinar is being recorded, you'd like to ask them after, more than welcome to. My only recommendation is write down where you had the question and what the specifics was, and then afterwards, Gregor and I can have a private conversation separately. So you don't have to feel like you have to present now, but if there are no questions, or if David doesn't have any other points, then I'll definitely keep going. So your microphone's muted, David. We can't hear what you're saying, unfortunately.
Kevin, I did have a very quick question.
Yeah,
if somebody was offered regular employment, but they actually would like to see if potentially they could work as an independent contractor instead, what would you suggest? Is that a situation that could come up, and how could that conversation go with a potential client?
Yeah, so it's gonna depend, one, the type of work you do, and two, the understanding. Under legal restrictions and the legal code in the United States, entities had previously practiced, swapping out employment for independent contracting, because when you're an independent contractor, you're responsible for your own health care, you're responsible for your own taxes and all of that. So it's seen as tax evasion. The biggest thing that you're going to want to check first and foremost is it possible for the deliverables to be done by a contractor instead of an employee? If they're not, then obviously you wouldn't be able to do so. If they are, the second thing you want to make sure is, well, how many contractors are already being paid by this client? So how many contractors are contracted? The biggest thing is you would not want your W-9 to trigger an IRS audit if your employer, not your employer, apologies, if your contractor has too many contracts, because then the IRS could say, are you substituting employees for contractors as a way of avoiding your financial responsibility? Now, let's say there's no issue there. Then the biggest thing is how do we structure the goals of the job so that it can be done as a contractor? So for example, if we're hiring and the job is for less than 9 months and there's only 3 deliverables, that's something that can be done fairly easy, where we can negotiate and I can say, as a contractor, these are the metrics I can do, these are the deliverables that can be met, and the biggest thing is these are the ways in which we can do that without supervision. That's the other part, is this responsibility require supervision? For example, if Gregor was given a grant of $500,000 and was expected to do routinely work, Gregor, as an employer, you would have to see, can the work that has to be done to meet the $500,000 grant, can it be done without supervision? And if it can't, then you may not be able to do contracting. So you want to check first and foremost, will my independent contracting trigger an IRS audit? Yes, no, okay. If it doesn't, then is it possible to do this work without supervision? So am I able to do this work for the same allotted time in my own ways as a contractee? Yes, no. And then from there, the last part is, what will the financial structure look like? For example, if Gregor was to be hired for a salaried position of $75,000 as the executive director of immigrant services, and Gregor said, well, I want to do that as a contractee, not as an employee. Well, the question would be, is it feasible and is it realistic for the university to pay Gregor all of that money as a contractee? And if so, what is the structure that can be put in place? Unfortunately, not everything can be done as a contractee, and that's why sometimes it gets a little harder to become an independent contractor. The other part too is, if Gregor's only doing one specialized skill, does it really make sense to be an employee to begin with? So the other part that I haven't mentioned before is, the biggest thing we've said about independent contractors is you have a specialized skill, a specialized typeset. So if the job requires more than one specialized skill or specialized typeset that you do not have extensive knowledge in, does it make sense for you to do that as a contractee, or is the realistic option that you might have to be an employee? I noticed that David's not muted anymore. So David, did you want to add any input?
Well, I just wanted to say what you said is very good. Great presentation. And a couple things just to reiterate what David was saying to the audience is, make sure you check to make sure your independent contractor status is okay. This is a big hot button out there, and Kevin, you can jump in and add to this. Look at what regulators are doing to Uber and Lyft. So it's a big issue. It's a big issue to employers, because if they, let me go back and pick up what something Kevin said. As an independent contractor, you have to pay all the Social Security taxes, all the FICA taxes. So you have to pay what the employer would have paid and what you would have paid. If you're an employee, the employer pays their part and take your part out of your salary. So there is a danger for employers if they misclassify you. IRS or somebody can come back much later and say, hey, that really was an employee, pay us this money. Of course, you've already paid the independent contractor and are gone, so you're facing huge fines and huge amount of money. So this is a big hot button, so don't get caught in the middle of it. And to reiterate what David or Kevin was saying, make sure you pay those taxes, because that will trigger an audit. Now, the only other thing I would add, Kevin, is I always tell people that to make sure that you set up a legal entity. I prefer LLCs. Now, some immigrants don't come with a whole lot of assets, but let's say you do. If you're an independent contractor and you have a contract and you mess something up, as Kevin used an example, you build a building and somebody sues you, they can sue for all your personal assets. So I always set up LLC. I have a friend who runs a construction business. It sounds a little excessive, but she sets up a separate LLC for every job she does. So Kevin, you want to add any of that? But anyway, great job, Kevin.
Yeah. And we will cover some of the LLC stuff as well as more of the nuanced structure. I believe we're saving that for next week, just because we do have that community member with Chica Snacks who will talk about their experiences. But let's get back into it. So the biggest thing that you want to make sure is, as an immigrant in the work you're doing, if you find that your work requires licensing, can you do that? The biggest thing to know is that nearly 1 in 4 professions require some sort of license to practice. So what this means is, of those jobs listed and the ones that we didn't list early in the presentation, almost 1 in 4 of those is going to require some sort of licensing. Under federal law, non-qualified immigrants are ineligible for a variety of licenses. The key word here being non-qualified. For example, if I want to become a medical practitioner, and let's say it's in a state like California or New York where non-citizens are able to do this work, I still have to prove that I'm qualified. I can't just say, hey, I want to be a nurse. I took a biology class in college and I know what a catheter is, therefore make me a nurse. You want to make sure that the work you're doing, if you're able to do this work, you can demonstrate qualifications. In the state of Colorado, the DORA is the governing agency. Go to this link and look over what they require. As we said before, in 2006, there was a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment that kind of swooped Colorado and Colorado legislature. So some of the jobs, you wouldn't even know it, but they require citizenship just to do the work. So for example, under Colorado statute, you're supposed to be a citizen to be a nail technician. For obvious reasons, there's a lot of anti-immigrant and specifically anti-API sentiments that kind of led to that. So you want to make sure that when you're getting professional licensure, one, you demonstrate you're qualified, but two, there aren't any restrictions based on citizenry. And if there are, what are states that do allow you to practice? And given the circumstances, if you have the ability and you have the skills to do that work, is it a good choice to get licensed or certified in another state, knowing that you can only do that work in that state? So we don't know where we'll be in November. None of us know where we'll live 5 years from now. So it's always good to make sure that if you do get licensed, you make sure your licensing gets transferred. But if you don't get licensed, then you say, hey, once I get my degree from Metro, whether it's undergraduate, graduate, or terminal, then you can make sure that there's no licensure issues attached to that. A lot of states right now, as David mentioned, because this is a hot topic, a lot of states have kind of restricted how lawful permanent residents, so even individuals who have LPR status and who are on their pathway to becoming citizens, they're even restricted in some of those ways. And Colorado is an example of that. You could be an LPR, but you still might not be able to be a licensed nail technician or a licensed cosmetologist, because in Colorado, you have to be a citizen for that. So the biggest thing, if you were to summarize this in 2 sentences and take away, is just make sure that 1, you can get licensed as a non-immigrant. 2, if you do have lawful permanent resident status, or you'll have it within the next 5 years, make sure that there aren't any restrictions on that profession. And then 3, finally, make sure that if you do get licensed as a non-immigrant or licensed, make sure that there aren't restrictions elsewhere. You can only do work in states in which you're licensed. So for example, if I go to California and I get licensed as an attorney, I can only do legal work in California. Now, if I want that license to transfer, I have to make sure that the states will also allow that. So I could go to New York if I wanted. I could even try Hawaii, but I wouldn't be able to come to Colorado because the state Supreme Court has said undocumented immigrants cannot practice law in Colorado. So it's one of those, when you do independent contracting or you go into business for yourself, there is a lot of risk in the personal investment. So make sure that the licensing, if needed, isn't a barrier, and if it is a barrier, make sure that it's not a long-term barrier. So what should your contract look like? You want to make sure that your contract has some of these, and the reason why we say some of these is because it's all going to depend on the work you do. These are all types of protections. First and foremost, make sure that the contract doesn't require you to work exclusively for the individual. That could be seen by the IRS as a means of employment. You may have a W-9, but as an independent contractor, the expectation is that you can work for multiple people at multiple times. So if the person says, hey, you can only work exclusively for us and you can only do so until this contract is fulfilled, it could seem to the IRS that that employer is kind of doing employee aversion, and that could land you and the employer in hot water. So always make sure that you are clear with the individual saying, I can't work exclusively for you. I can allocate X amount of times or X amount of hours, but it cannot be a one-one relationship, because at that point, I could be seen as an employee and I may not have work authorization to be an employee. You may not want to do that for legal tax reasons. And ultimately, it doesn't benefit you as a contractor or as someone who's doing business for yourself to only stick to one person. As the old saying goes, you never want to put all your eggs in one basket. Make sure that the client does not establish a quality standard. It is you as the independent contractor who gets to decide how the work is done and the tools and methods in which. You want to make sure that that is not overseen or supervised by the contractee. They're not your employer. They don't have the authority to tell you how to do the work. So with that same framework in mind, you don't want them to set the quality standard. That's your responsibility. It's the client's job to make sure that the deliverables are met, and the client can give you a satisfactory or unsatisfactory, but you don't want it to be known as a quality standard, because at that point they're governing over you. And with that, in the same way, make sure it's not a fixed salary or an hourly rate. Consultation in the state of Colorado averages $100 per hour, but with that, it's not a fixed hourly rate. It's not saying, hey, I'm going to do contract work for Gregor for 20 hours a week at this rate and only that. I'm not working exclusively for Gregor, so I can say for every hour I spend on this, it'll be $100. And at that point, y'all can decide how to distribute the hours. It's you as the independent contractor who sets your schedule and decides that, but you never want it to be a fixed salary or a fixed rate. And the biggest reason is you're not an employee. You don't want to have the pay structure of an employee, because that can land your entity in some hot waters as well. Finally, you want to make sure that the client is not bound to terminate work during the period unless there's a violation. The biggest reason for this is Colorado is an at-will state. That only applies to employees. As contractees, you want to make sure that you get paid with due diligence for the work you're doing and the pay is equitable. And you want to make sure that with that you have some protections. So you want to say that the contractee can terminate the contract if the client violates, or the individual can terminate the contract with you if you violate something. But you never want them to say, hey, we can terminate the contract at any given period in time, because at that point, there's no guarantee. Let's say I do 50 hours for Gregor and Gregor says, hey, I'm just going to terminate you. Well, legally, Gregor may not be bound to pay me if there's a provision in there that says Gregor can terminate at any time and Gregor's entitled to the work. So as always, you decide the contract. There are countless of templates online of what contracts look like. There are clinics in the state of Colorado that provide this, as well as small business bureaus throughout the state that also show you how to build contracts. I think that UndocuHub will also do some of this work, but for the time being, just make sure that when you're doing a contract, you're not giving too much power to the to the client or the contractee. The last one is they can't provide the tools or benefits to the individual. The only thing they can provide is materials and equipment that must be built or supplied. So for example, if Gregor is going to ask me to build a porch for him, I can put it in the contract that Gregor is responsible for buying the wood and the nails as well as other materials, but I can't make Gregor get the tools as well. Those have to come from me. So depending on how you do your contract, depending on the type of work you do, you want to make sure that you're not being paid benefits, because your W-9 says that you're being held responsible for those, not the client, as well as the materials are provided, but not the tools. So Gregor can give me the wood, the nails, and the concrete to build him a porch, but he can't give me the hammers or the other tools. There's
Kevin,
more information. Yeah,
just,
go ahead.
Just with you're not screen sharing at this point, so if you have some slides to show, just a quick reminder.
Weird. It was saying on my side that I was sharing. Let's try that. Can you see it now?
There you go. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So the last thing I'll say is obviously everyone will have access to this presentation after the fact. So if you just go on in this website, you can look at more on what contracts should look like in the state of Colorado. You have rights as an independent contractor. Although you're not employed and you're not granted the same work protections, there are still some rights. The first one, obviously, is federal employment laws. As an independent contractor, you don't get any of the federal employment protections, but you're also have other provisions. Unfortunately, with employment laws, a lot of this is just going to be things that you can't get. For example, you're not protected by Title VII. You're not protected or entitled to sick leave or care providers. You're not required to the minimum wage, as we mentioned before. And if for those of you who have disabilities, unless it's in your contract, you're not guaranteed, and the client does not have to provide you with accommodations under the American with Disability Act. And finally, the client is not responsible for your compensation benefits. Obviously, everything that you get paid has to either be upfront or in a structured system, but that's only in lump sums. The benefits you have to take care of, and you have to do that for yourself. Misclassification. This is one of the big ones that you want to make sure when you're building your contract. And this also goes to what Gregor was alluding to earlier. What if I want to do work, but I want to be a contractor instead of an employee? Well, with that, you want to make sure that you're not being misclassified. If you're hired on as an independent contractor, but you're being treated as an employee, and for examples of that, that can be your schedule is being schedules being dictated towards you, you're being threatened with the contract being pulled or terminated at will, you are able to have a claim with both the IRS as well as with the Department of Labor on misclassification. The reason why this is such a hot topic right now is because Uber and Lyft, as well as others like DoorDash and Instacart, are being put under scrutiny for misclassifying contractors as employees in the ways in which they're dictating things. The biggest thing is if you do enter this work and you feel that you're being misclassified, or you feel that you're doing work that is outside of your bounds as an independent contractor, you can go to the Colorado Department of Labor, you can report this, and depending on the damages, you might have potential legal action. The Department of Labor will obviously be the biggest entity there to provide legal sanctions and punishments depending on what the client is doing, but you might also have other ones. Obviously, before you do anything, consult an attorney, talk to an individual who is properly trained and certified in doing this work. But just know that as an independent contractor, if you're being taken advantage of, you do have an outlet to go to. It's not the best, but it is one of those protections. In addition to that, independent contractors in Colorado are not protected by anti-discrimination laws or Title VII. So sexual harassment and discrimination, those are always a lot of instances that arise with independent contracting. In other states like New York and California, independent contractors are given those provisions. So if for whatever reason you were to become a contractor outside of that, you would be able to do that. In Colorado right now, there is legislation where sexual protections and discrimination based on sexual identity are trying to be expanded for independent contractors, but right now that's really not there. So the closest thing you have again is misclassification, and if in that misclassification you have employment discrimination, you can reach out to the EEOC, which is the Equal Employer Opportunity Center office. Finally, as an independent contractor, you are able to join a union. Although you're not an employee and you're not protected under the National Labor Relations Act, you can still join a union. These unions can help you secure health and equipment for your entity. They can also help you with insurance, contract advice, as well as helping you find secure clients. Some instances of this, for example, with those who work for Lyft and Uber, is the Rideshare Drivers United, and for those who do a lot of work in media as contractees, the Pacific Media Workers Guild. So although you're not protected with the Labor Relations Act as when you organize, you can still join a union, and in that union you can still get some protections. Now, for me, this is a good stopping point. We'll continue off next 2 weeks from now, actually, starting off with the legal structure for the businesses. In addition, we'll also cover some of the entry stuff for taxes and how, as an entity, you set up your account, what's some good things to look at when having someone do your taxes. As an entity, it's always recommended that you work with a tax accountant or a tax agent, unless you yourself are one. So we'll go into some of those tips and some good resources, but I think this is a good stopping point. Are there any questions from folks here today? I know that was a lot. We will give access to the complete presentation at the end of the next one. So not this week, but in 2 weeks from now. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Just reiterate what Kevin said is make sure that you set up an accounting system so you get all of your revenues and receipts and taxes so you can do your taxes right, and it's always set up in an accounting system. And I know Kevin's going to cover that legal structure next time, but make sure you set up a legal structure. I always do that. Okay, back to you, Gregor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both Kevin and David. This might be a good time for some quick questions, either to David or to Kevin, about some of these basics when it comes to entrepreneurship. A lot of ground was covered, as Kevin said. A lot of that stuff can take a while to sink in. Please refer to the chat function. Many of the offices and governmental agencies that Kevin was referring to, I put the name and the links there. There is also the Undocu Career Guide, which you can find on the Immigrant Services Program webpage, that has some of the information that Kevin was covering, as well as some local resources where you can help, for example, applying for an IT number or getting help with small business administration related questions. There are some questions from the group.
Gregor, can I pipe in here? I had a PowerPoint. We don't have time for it, but basically I wanted to express to the group that, hey, Kevin got you started. You can start a business. There's a myth out there that entrepreneurs have to be business students. Actually, the truth is that more folks, more immigrants, women start businesses than my business students. So you can do it. The other myth is that entrepreneurs are risk takers. Generally, they figure out how they do a lot of their risk mitigation by doing a great contract. So good job, Kevin. Anyway, the big thing that entrepreneurs have is an entrepreneurial mindset. They look for opportunities other people don't see. So rather than doing the whole PowerPoint, I hit the main points there, Gregor. So if you want me to cover anything else, I will.
Sounds great. I'm going to very quickly share a flyer that I got from you, David. This is specifically for a program called Launch Denver. Maybe, David, you want to introduce what Launch Denver is? We
set up a program. If I try to start talking about how to start a business, it's a whole semester class and requires accounting, whatever. But in Launch Denver, we have a program where we're training anybody in the community. You can be a business student, non-business student, alumni, staff, person of the community. So we're starting that this training starts in the middle of this month. It's for anybody. There's no fee. One of my friends, Becky Prater, is teaching that. We do 9 Wednesday evenings. And at the end of it, we give you a mentor that will help you take your business idea and pursue it. So if you look up on the Launch Denver website, if you go to MSU Denver, just do search, you'll find it. Anyway, the application is there, or you can call or write Becky Prater, P-R-A-T-R, and talk about in the class. Right now, she still has some openings. So if you're interested in learning more about how to start your business and getting some help in doing it, we had a couple of people last year who took that, then applied for a grant and got a grant. So take a serious look at that. That's it, Gregor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Unless there are any further questions from the group, for which we certainly would have a few minutes, I think that is a good point to refer everybody to next week after next week's workshop. So on September 15th, same time, Tuesday, September 15th, 1 to 2 o'clock. As Kevin said, we're going to hear from a recent graduate from MSU Denver who launched Chica Snacks, which actually does really very, very tasty snacks. I bought a good number of their products and actually sent some to friends and family because they're really fantastic. And she and some others will talk about her experience and their experience starting that business. So issues that they ran into, things that surprised them, maybe tips that they would have for individuals who are just starting to think about starting their own business, forming an LLC, either producing a product or offering services. So please tune in for that when you get a chance. As always, please make sure to sign up for those workshops so that we can send you a link. I will make sure to put the sign up link for this and all of the other workshops that are coming up this semester into the chat function here in a second. Any closing words, perhaps of encouragement, David and Kevin, because it can certainly seem overwhelming, right? To think about entrepreneurship.
It might look overwhelming, but you can do it. All you have to do is have the mindset that can do it. Hey, if you fail, just get up again. I failed as an entrepreneur, gotten up again, and hey, if you ever take one of my classes, I'll tell you some of my success stories and some of my failures. So you have the right, just get the right mindset, you can do it.
The biggest thing I would say, especially for the folks we're serving in these series, is you already know what it's like to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Just make sure that as you're doing this work, you're protected and you agree with the work you're doing. A lot of times, folks of immigrant backgrounds, documented, undocumented, and everything in between, are put in positions where they have to do work for the sake of survival. Entrepreneurship is not like that. You're supposed to do the work that you like to do and that you're specialized in doing. So be comfortable with that and make sure that you're never put in a position where you don't like the work you're doing or you don't like the client that you're doing work for. You get to decide how to do the work, who to do the work for, and how much your worth is. Take full advantage of that. As immigrants, we're told that we don't get a voice. This is really meant to show y'all that not only do you have a voice, but these are some of the benefits that come with using your voice more.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for your time, for your expertise. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. We hope this was a good start. And again, there is more to come. Let me reiterate one of the things that Kevin was saying. The UndocuHub community serving program is going to really get started in the next couple of weeks and months. And one very big aspect is to provide one-on-one support for community members who are thinking about starting their own business, and specifically UndocuHub is going to focus on working with undocumented community members in the state of Colorado, but we'll also be able, of course, to serve other immigration statuses. So we will probably provide some very important information also to DACA recipients, temporary protected status individuals. And so stay tuned for that. I did put the link to the just early stages of the UndocuHub website in the chat function right at the top. My email is in the chat function. David and Kevin, if you would like, feel free to, of course, put your email in the chat function as well. But all of us are going to be available for questions, and at the very least, you can certainly contact me, and I'll make sure if I cannot answer the question, then I'll make sure that Kevin or David can provide a good answer there. I think that's a good place for us to end. It's almost 2 o'clock. Thanks again, David. Thanks again, Kevin. This has been very informative and hopefully a very good start for all of us to start thinking about how to improve entrepreneurship resources on campus and to potentially pursue those ourselves.